Hello everyone, my name is Dr Emily Grossman and I'm a science broadcaster, author and co-founder of Extinction Rebellion Scientists. And I'm proud to welcome you to the first Ask a Scientist Live of 2021, organised by XR Scientists. So this is the start of a new series of events where each month we'll discuss a different topic relating to the climate and ecological emergency, giving you at home the chance to pose the questions you've always wanted answering directly to some of the world's leading researchers and thinkers in their field. Today, I'm very excited to introduce a discussion on beyond optimism or doom. How can we communicate the need for urgent climate action? So as a professional science communicator myself, this is a topic that's very close to my heart. Ever since I found out the true extent of the environmental crises that we face, I've made it my mission to get the truth about the emergency out to as many people as I can. However, environmental sciences are complicated. How do we balance the need to communicate the harsh realities in language that everyone can understand, in ways that they can relate to, and will get on board with emotionally, spurring them into action, while still staying true to the science? Until recently, the received wisdom was that any messaging on climate issues must conclude with an optimistic and hopeful message, or you risk sending the listener into a depression, leading to hopelessness and paralysis. However, as the climate situation has deteriorated, a new generation of movements such as Extinction Rebellion have rewritten that rulebook, raising environmentalism up the agenda by sounding the alarm with clear, urgent demands, stark messaging on what we face if we fail to act, and asking people to grieve for the natural world, accepting that we might not save the planet. However, some scientists and commentators have raised concerns that some Extinction Rebellion speakers go beyond the science, leading to accusations of doomism, the belief that it is already too late to prevent disaster. So with all of the conflicting views and information out there, how do we know what's the best course of action? What's the best way to communicate with people to get them truly on board with the reality of what's going on the planet and the urgency with which we need to act? To discuss this topic, we have a phenomenal panel of world-class experts. So let me introduce them. Firstly, we have Dr. Margaret Klein Salamon, a clinical psychologist who left practice to dedicate her life to bringing about emergency transformation that we need, founding the Climate Mobilization Project, and most recently becoming Executive Director of the Climate Emergency Fund. Secondly, we have Dr. Stuart Capstick, Deputy Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation Centre at the University of Cardiff. Third, we have Rosemary Randall. Ro is a trained psychotherapist, author, and advisor for the Climate Psychology Alliance, who specialises in understanding the emotional impact of talking about climate issues. And last, but certainly not least, we have longtime veteran of the climate wars, inventor of the hockey stick graph, distinguished professor of atmospheric science and director of Earth System Science at Penn State University, Professor Michael Mann. What I'm now going to do is to give each of our panelists 2 minutes to tell us all a little bit more about who they are and some of their main thoughts on the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So Margaret, can we start with you, please?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. This is a really exciting event and a really important topic. As Emily mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist turned climate activist, and I made that transformation about 8 years ago when my good friend said to me, don't just write about the climate, which I was starting to do, think what could we do to actually solve this? And that huge framing, right? That's our goal here, right? That's, as Emily said, it might not work, but that has to be what we aim for, is a full solution, as full as we can go, to this climate and ecological crisis. And from the beginning, I applied a psychological and cultural lens to the problem, asking basically, why are we committing passive suicide? Amitav Ghosh writes about the great derangement in literature, about how literature just is ignoring the climate emergency, just isn't grappling with it. When you do start writing about it, it's considered climate fiction, cli-fi, but it's not fiction, it's reality. So I think of our cultural situation as truly a great derangement. And what I advocate is very much along the lines of XR and Greta, the idea that this is an emergency. We must treat it like an emergency. We must tell the truth and act like the truth is real as individuals, as a movement, and ultimately as governments. And I think that approach, the kind of maximalist, telling the truth, feeling it emotionally, and moving into emergency mode, again, individually, as a movement, and then as governments, that is the only hope that I can see. I can't imagine how we can kind of cajole people, the public, move them along, and governments with incrementalism, a good policy here, something, a carbon price there, non-disruptive, nobody has to make any sacrifices. I just can't possibly imagine that working. The scale is too great. So I think strategically, there's an imperative. We need to go for the full transformation advocacy and approach. And that means telling the truth and acting like that truth is real.
Brilliant. Thank you. Very clear, Margaret. Thanks for introducing yourself and your views on this really important topic. So let's move to Stuart.
Hello, everyone. It's very good to be here with you all. I'm Stuart Capstick. As Emily mentioned a moment ago, I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. I also work within the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. So the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or the CAST Centre for short, it's based in the UK, but we have partners and partner organisations internationally. And within our research centre, we are running a wide range of projects, from looking at climate policy to grassroots initiatives to ways of involving citizens in decision making. But the main research question that spans the 20 or so projects that make up the CAST Centre is how can we live differently and better in ways that meet the need for rapid emissions reduction. And when I was thinking about the kind of question for this discussion, how do we communicate the need for urgent climate action, that seemed very relevant to me. I think that question, how can we live better, is critical to bear in mind. Yes, we need to cut emissions, and quickly, as Margaret just talked about, and we need to communicate that, and that it's essential to do so in order to avoid some pretty horrendous outcomes. But we also need to know what kind of future is it we're aiming for. What is this transformation that we want to see, and how can we move towards low carbon societies which are also fairer, healthier, more peaceful, more fulfilling? And so I think this is at the core of the question. If we want to get across the need for urgent climate action, it's important we also try to engage with people in terms of that shared sense of purpose.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you. So let's move on to Rosemary, or Ro. We'll call you Ro.
Hi, like everybody else, I'm delighted to be here and fascinated by the breadth of experience on this panel. So I'm a psychoanalytically trained psychotherapist, and what that means is that the kind of psychological work that I do and that I'm interested in is what lies beneath the surface, the things which we can't speak about with ease, the things which trouble us. I'm very interested in how we're formed by our personal histories as we grow up as children. And I'm very interested in the ways that this plays out in the field that is often referred to as psychosocial, the way that these unconscious processes play out in the bigger political and social world. And I've been active in the climate movement since about 2005. And where my work is focused on using therapeutic understandings to try to explore people's reluctance to engage with climate issues, trying to help people to move beyond the defensiveness that so many people manifest when you mention the word climate wherever you are. And find ways to help climate activists to communicate better, to take account of the kinds of defences that come up when you raise something which is actually very difficult for people to hear and runs contrary to so many expectations that people have been raised with. And over the years that I've been active, I've set up a number of different projects which have worked in this area. Emily mentioned one, which is the Carbon Conversations project, which brings people together to talk about the impact of climate change on their lives and what they can actually do in their personal lives to have an effect. I'm a founder member of the Climate Ecological Alliance, which has been doing a lot of research and is increasingly doing practical work with people around these issues. And I'm currently active in Cambridge with my local group called Cambridge Climate Therapists, where we're running workshops and groups on how to cope emotionally with the climate crisis and how to communicate better. So that's the main focus of my work.
Thank you, Ro. And finally, last but not least, over to you, Mike.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be part of this very important conversation here today. So as Emily alluded to earlier, I have sort of been on the front lines of the climate wars now for more than 2 decades because of this graph, the hockey stick that my co-authors and I published back in the late 1990s. It became a lightning rod for climate change deniers, and I found myself in the center of the very confrontational battle, war, if you like, over climate action, where powerful vested interests, we know who they are, fossil fuel companies and those who advocate for them, have engaged in a massive disinformation campaign to prevent us from making the needed changes, from decarbonizing our civilization. And today we find ourselves at sort of a unique point where the impacts of climate change have become obvious to the person on the street. So the forces of denial and delay can no longer claim climate change isn't happening, but they're also not going to simply throw in the towel. They are committed to keeping us addicted to fossil fuels for as long as they can. My latest book, The New Climate War, is really about the tactics that they are using to try to prevent us from moving on. And I won't go into those in detail here, but one of them is indeed sort of weaponizing doomism, trying to convey the idea that it is too late to do anything at all about the problem, because if they can convince us of that, it potentially leads us down that same path of disengagement as outright denial. And so we have to be very careful. We have to be faithful to the science. We have to emphasize the urgency of acting now and the damage that's already occurring, but we also have to convey the very real agency that still exists. It isn't too late for us to prevent a catastrophic future.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, super clear summary of exactly where we are, I think, and where we all are and what we all feel needs to be done, but exactly how is somewhat challenging, I think. So we're now going to open up to questions from our audience. So just to remind you, for anyone who's joined us late or has just come online, we're going to be discussing beyond optimism or doom. How can we communicate the need for urgent climate action? So we've got about an hour for this Q&A, so we should have plenty of time to hear from quite a lot of you. Some questions have already been sent to us in advance, but if you're watching live and you've got any questions you'd like to ask our panel or anyone in particular on the panel, please post them in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Please do remember, if you're willing to give us your name also and where you're from. So our first question is from Mike, and this is a question from Nick from the Climate Communications Hub. So Nick's question is this: it is absolutely key that we communicate a clear, evidence-based message about risk. A lot of scientists are warning us about the catastrophic risks of tipping points. How do we know when will it be too late to avoid disaster? Tough one there, Nick. From Nick. Mike, over to you.
Well, it depends on how we define disaster. If you're Puerto Rico, disaster is here. If you're the Western US that's seen epic wildfires, disaster is here. If you're Australia, where I did a sabbatical last year, I lived through the Black Summer. In fact, I saw Margaret down there, and they are living what is already a somewhat disastrous reality. And so at this point, we have to accept that a certain amount of harm is inevitable. It's already here, but there is still time to make sure that it doesn't get much worse. And we have to sort of move away from this binary framing where we either act or we don't, where there's a cliff that we go off if we allow the planet to warm 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. To me, it's much more like a very dangerous highway that we're going down. And we have to get off at the nearest exit. And we might miss the 1.5 degrees Celsius exit. That doesn't mean that we don't still try to get off at the 1.6 exit. And if we miss that, the 1.7 exit. Every bit of carbon that we don't burn creates a better future for us. And we have to keep that in mind. Once again, there is great urgency. Dangerous climate change, by some measure, has arrived. And at this point, it's simply a question of how bad we're willing to let it get.
Wow, thank you so much, Mike. It was a very clear and concise answer to a very challenging question that I know a lot of people out there are sort of going, well, when is it too late? Is it 1.5? Is it 2? Is it any 3 or 4? But yeah, absolutely, it's every fraction of a degree, every point of a degree is important, is what I've heard you say. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to our second question that's come in advance, and that is from Jassel from Fridays for Future Columbia, and it's a question to Margaret. So the question is, how possible is the necessary energy transition this decade, given economic policy is still hesitant to stop fossil fuels exploitation? It's been described as a World War II style mobilization. How do we communicate the need for this without scaring the general public or making them feel like it is impossible? Again, really important question that I think is on a lot of our minds at the moment. So Margaret, would you be willing to answer that for us?
Yes, thank you. All right, so there's a few pieces here. One that I want to start with is the statement that we need to communicate this without scaring the general public, because I strongly disagree with that. And I think that it's something that the climate movement has really struggled with and really gotten wrong, to be frank. So as a clinical psychologist, I help people change by helping them face the truth and process their emotions, feel their emotions, express their emotions, right? Because all emotions are acceptable, and we should welcome them, not be afraid of them. What matters, what has moral heft, is our actions. So climate, coming from the sector of science, right? It was scientists who raised the alarm, who explained what was happening and predicted this whole catastrophe. Because we come out of that tradition, I think there's, let's say, not a psychological or a clinical understanding of how emotions work and how they contribute to transformative change. So let's talk about fear for a second. Fear is an evolved emotion for humans and other animals. It is a self-protective mechanism. If we didn't feel fear, we wouldn't take appropriate action to protect ourselves. Should scientists and doctors and governments try to keep us from being afraid of COVID? Should they change their messaging to prevent fear? No. It's reasonable to be afraid of getting a horrible disease, just like it's absolutely reasonable to be afraid of the collapse of civilization due to the climate emergency. So I don't think we as campaigners should go out and saying, oh, we're going to scare the heck out of people. But we should go out and say, we are going to tell the truth. And we are going to allow people to experience that in its fullness, in the emotional side, the intellectual side, the spiritual side of asking, what does life even mean under these circumstances? What is my purpose? So, okay, so that's that's what I want to say first about that we can make the public afraid. That's not something we need to avoid. In fact, I think we do ourselves a terrible disservice when we set out with that. Because if we say, well, we can't make people afraid, and the reality is terrifying, then you kind of start about euphemizing and fudging what is really true. So, all right, that's part of the question. Next part, how likely is it that we're going to achieve the transition that we need? I'm not sure. I don't think it's terribly high. I mean, everything, all of our current systems and inertia is going towards fossil fuels and destruction. But I guess I don't think it's the right question, because whether it's 50% or 10% or 1% or 0.01%, it's what we need to go for. It's a moral imperative. What else matters but protecting humanity and the living world? So we, through our dedication and our own personal transformation, we make it more likely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really clear. I've got a quick question before we move on. You mentioned about how it's important that we do activate people through fear, because it is a scary situation. I couldn't agree more. One concern that people have raised to me and many times is that sometimes when people get afraid, they're not able to act, because of course when we get stressed, we might be moved into fight or flight, to run or to do something or to take action, but we might just shut down. We might get overwhelmed, frozen, paralyzed, confused, or just totally kind of checked out. So do you have a perspective on that?
Yes. Emotions should be viewed not as static, but as like unfolding through a process. So if I feel scared, that's not all I'm ever going to feel, right? And if I feel grief, that is also a process that I can move through. So that's one thing. I think that recognizing the power and the pain and the challenge that climate reality has to our emotional lives and our psyche is really important. So we should recognize that and try to attend to that through things like Ro mentioned, like conversation and creating spaces for processing and mutual support. So we should attend to those feelings, but we should not alter the message. We should never compromise the truth in order to kind of like manipulate, to attempt to manipulate those emotional reactions.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that was so clearly and succinctly put, and thanks for explaining that to everyone, to us here and everyone watching. Mike, is there something that you wanted to add on this point? Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick follow-up. I basically concur with what Margaret has said here. I do have concerns about the misrepresentation of the science, and that can play out in different ways. One of my concerns involves certain claims that have been made by certain actors in this space who claim that it's too late to prevent runaway warming and that all life on Earth will be extinguished within 10 years, no matter what we do. And in fact, that was 5 years ago. So I guess we've got 5 years left now. Those doomist narratives invariably all seem to come out of a distortion of a particular area of the science that has to do with Arctic methane. This idea that we're already seeing runaway methane released from the permafrost, and that's going to create runaway warming. The science just doesn't support that at all, but it's become very widespread within, again, sort of the doomist narratives, this idea that we're already undergoing runaway warming and there's nothing we can do about it. That's a distortion of the scientific evidence that's essentially as bad as the distortions that we see by climate change deniers. And we have to call out those distortions regardless of where we see them, because they do potentially lead to false narratives, the narrative of doom. So as I've already said, there is a lot of bad stuff that's already happening and that we're committed to. And so, dangerous climate change has arrived, but it is not the case that we are doomed, that runaway warming is underway, and that all life on Earth will be extinct within 10 years. And that is very unhelpful messaging that is premised on a distortion of the science.
Yes, thank you, Mike. It's really important, as you say, that we get that distinction. Margaret, I think there was something you wanted to say to respond to that. You're muted, Margaret. Margaret, you're muted.
Thank you. And thanks, Mike. I agree, and I've seen it. The overblown scientific certainty of total destruction combined with they say Earth in hospice, like, give up everybody, what, and I agree that is problematic. Deeply so, with the core being, give up. Again, it doesn't matter how exactly bad the science is. We have a moral duty to try. But I did just want to add, because I think this is, this is just another issue that's live in this discourse, is that science only gets us so far in analyzing what the future will bring. Right? Science can tell us there's going to be more droughts and that's going to affect food production, but it can't tell us what the political and economic and military implications of that will be. So I think one thing, and in a way, from a communications perspective, I think that's actually helpful, because I want people to feel comfortable communicating about climate without feeling like they have to have a master's degree in science. And so to zoom out a little bit to a systems perspective, that we're changing the fundamental conditions on which our civilization and agricultural system developed. And by doing that, we're risking all sorts of horrible impacts and collapse scenarios. That the, let's say, the extent of the damage goes beyond the physical impacts and into the social and political ones. Okay, thank you. That's enough.
Brilliant. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, again, very important. So thank you for raising that. So I think we'll move on to our next question, because there'll be lots of time to have sort of similar content, I suppose, when other questions come in, actually. So this third question I'd like to pose to Stuart, and it's a question from Scott in Manchester. And the question is, what actions can individuals take to address climate change? Is it a distraction to focus on individual actions rather than the need for systemic and structural change? So Stuart, if you'd like to comment on that, that would be great.
Thanks very much, Emily. Thanks, Scott, as well. And this speaks to a sort of ongoing debate, again, that I think is very live in the discourse around climate communication, sort of individual versus system debate. Ironically, perhaps, I think one of the best things that individuals can do to take action is a sort of action that helps to bring about that very systemic structural change that many of us want to see. And a kind of an obvious but important example of that are the sorts of social movements that have sprung up, particularly over the last kind of 2 or 3 years, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, and so on, and which have, are driving the sort of national conversation and changing the politics around climate change. And it's worth remembering that all of those movements are made up of individuals taking action with their own passion and concern to make change. So that's one type of arguably individual action that we can take that is part of something bigger. I suppose more usually when we talk about individual action, we mean things like household energy use and driving smaller cars and so on. And there's a question of whether focusing on those sorts of actions risk being a distraction. And I know a lot of people are kind of quite rightly concerned that the much bigger, more complex problem of climate change doesn't get sort of put at the feet, put onto the responsibility of individuals, and that's quite right, and I totally agree with that, because things like whether we can travel in a sustainable low carbon way has a lot to do with where we live, with the transport system we have, the energy provision we have available to us, and so on. And so it's absolutely the job of kind of policy makers, politicians, government to change that, and we need to demand that they do change that. One thing I would say, I'm a little bit worried. I mean, my background is in psychology and kind of behavior and lifestyle change and so on. And I've grown a little bit worried the last sort of couple of years that the pendulum is swinging a little bit too far in the direction away from individual action. I think it's becoming a bit commonplace to actually sort of denigrate the role of individuals in taking action. And we have to be a bit careful on that, I think, because there's a danger in that it can make people feel like they have no part in tackling the climate crisis. If you say this has nothing to do with individuals, it's all about the system, then that very important sense of agency and connection and being part of solving the problem, we've just got to be careful we don't lose that and make people feel that there is nothing that they can do to be involved.
Thank you, Stuart. Ro, you've got your hand up. Would you like to comment on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Stuart was saying, which is I think that the purpose in some ways of taking individual action to reduce your own impact is that psychologically what it does is it restores to you a sense of integrity, and that sense of integrity is very important when you're then moving into action, particularly when you're wanting to communicate with others about the issue.
Yeah. Very important. I think that very much speaks to activists as well, because yes, absolutely, it's all about systemic change, but if we're not living it in our own lives, then it's easy to feel that we're sort of misaligned somehow, that we're not walking the walk and talking the talk. Just before we move on, the question we were just answering, actually, we've kind of sidetracked slightly, but about the how possible it is. This necessary energy transition. Is it going to be possible this decade, given that the economic policy is still hesitant to stop fossil fuel exploitation? Just before we move on to our next question, I wondered, Stuart, for example, do you have any comment on that, sort of something brief that can reassure us, perhaps?
I don't know if I'd do reassuring. I mean, I think I would echo Margaret. Maybe not. I mean, the biggest uncertainty in these things, it isn't the technology. We know we have the technology to build low carbon. So that the uncertainties are in the sort of social and political and cultural domain, and that's why this area can be so infuriating. We know that we could be doing the right thing, but we have we have governments who we may not always have the greatest faith in, shall we put that euphemistically, and as Mike has pointed out, there are bad actors in this whole domain trying to keep fossil fuels subsidized rather than renewable sources supported. So I think that the fight is in the social, cultural, political domain, and that's where there's the greatest uncertainty, I'd say.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. Mike, I noticed you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks. I agree with everything that's just been said. And one thing I did want to point out is that some of these bad actors that Stuart has just alluded to, one of them is our friend British Petroleum, BP, that gave us the first carbon footprint calculator back in the early 2000s. And that's because British Petroleum and other fossil fuel companies want us so focused on our own carbon footprint that we ignore theirs. 70% of the carbon emissions come from 100 polluting companies. So the answer, of course, as we all agree here, it's both. It's individual action. Of course, we should do all those things that we do in our everyday lives to decrease our environmental and carbon footprint. Often they make us healthier, they save us money, they set a good example for other people. We should do all of those things, absolutely. And we should engage in all of the collective actions that we can to force the hand of policymakers. But what we can't allow is for polluters to make it sound like the solution is entirely individual behavioral change at the expense of the systemic change that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Margaret.
I just wanted to continue that by saying, Rose said it gives a sense of integrity. The opposite is a sense of shame and guilt that many, many people feel, that has been way too much of the emotional content of climate messaging. And as Mike said, that also comes from an intentional effort. So I just know so many people in my own life who know me as a climate campaigner view me not based on anything that I have said or done, but view me as like a scold.
Yeah, I can definitely identify with that, and I'm sure a lot of people watching can as well. Thank you. So I'd like to now direct a question directly to Ro. This is a question from Hazel in Bristol, who says, how do we work with the huge psychological defensive denial that we've seen people use in the climate crisis? Yes, very meaty one there.
Okay, so I think it's important to understand that there are different forms of denial. And the one which I think is most common is not the outright denial where people say it's not happening. I think that is largely a thing of the past. But what you're much more likely to encounter is what sometimes feels like indifference. And there's a word which is used in psychoanalysis for this form of denial. We call it disavowal. And what this means is that you don't deny the facts of climate change, but you deny its significance, you deny its meaning, and you deny that it's going to have any impact on you, you deny that you can do anything about it, and you use this as a way to keep the knowledge that you have that climate change is there and climate change is real in a separate box. And this means that you can just carry on as normal. And I think that there are different ways that we can approach this question, and it depends very much whether we're talking to somebody individually, face to face, whether you're engaged in a sort of small casual conversation that you might have when you're on a protest or when you run into somebody at the shops, or whether you've actually got the platform and you're public speaking. But I think what you need to be aware of all the time is that there is a reason for this defense, because that's what it is. This is the way that people protect themselves from something which they know in their heart of hearts is extremely dangerous and requires them to think about it and to think about the way their life is and to think about everything that is going on in the world. And a lot of people are understandably very reluctant to do that. And so I think you encounter that again and again and again in different forms. And I've got a lot of things I could say about the different ways that we communicate in these different areas, but perhaps that might come up in another question. So that's maybe just enough for now, just to describe these different forms of denial that we encounter.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it will come up again and again, but is there anything you can say just as a sort of, dare I say, a summary or an overview? Because I'm sure a lot of us have come up against this denial, whether it's when we're out on the streets or whether it's when we're talking to our own friends and family or next door neighbours, whatever level we are of our own activism or our own awareness. How do we deal with it without just sort of going up against, as you say, people's fear and people's defensiveness?
So the first thing to understand is that there are two different levels in a conversation that are going on. And the surface one is what we call the content. And this is where we mostly concentrate. And climate campaigners particularly often concentrate on the information that they want to get across. This is the content. And we operate on the basis of what's called information deficit theory. We act as if the problem is that people don't have the right information, and that if they did have the right information, then they would simply do what we expect. And what you need to concentrate on is the kind of all of the iceberg that's underneath the surface. And in that in that iceberg primarily are people's emotions and their reactions. And so you need to listen to the feeling that is coming across to you. And so when you see somebody begin to fidget and they begin to move away from you as you're talking, that's telling you that they're uncomfortable. And so what you then need to do is that you need to start to pay attention to that. So I might say to somebody who looks like they're getting a little bit uncomfortable because I've said, oh, I don't fly anymore. And they go, ooh. I think that looks like it's making you feel quite uncomfortable. It looks like you're, and I'll then see whether I get a response from that. So what I'm doing all the time is I'm chasing down the defense. I am trying to talk with them about the feeling that they have about what I'm saying, because it's only by getting them to talk about the feeling that I'm ever going to get past this defense. So this idea that there is content and there is process, there's the way the conversation is going on, there's the expectations we have of each other, there's the way we protect ourselves from things we can't quite bear to think about. There are all the fantasies that we have of each other, which Margaret mentioned earlier, this way that you have projected onto you, the idea that you're trying to make people feel guilty. What you have to do is to try to begin to talk about those things. So I might say to a friend, oh, you seem to see me as a real killjoy. Oh, that's hurtful. I don't like that. So all the time, what I'm doing is talking about the process of what is going on.
So it's like you're noticing how they're feeling, either because you can feel it or you're noticing their body language or what they're doing, they're fidgeting, and you're reflecting that back. You're sort of saying, oh, I'm noticing you're doing this, or it's making me feel like this. And then you're kind of actually talking about what's under the tip of the iceberg rather than just giving more information.
Exactly, because what happens with more information is that you're pushing somebody away by doing that. And I think you always need to be very alert in a conversation to the point at which somebody has heard enough. They're finding it hard to process it. And that's the point where you need to come in, you need to help them process it. And you need to show that you're listening, that you're curious, that you care about how they're feeling. And those things will all help you have much better conversations.
Thank you, Ro. I'm sure a lot of people watching and listening will find that incredibly helpful. Mike, I noticed you've got your hand up. Did you want to add something here? And then we will move on to the next question.
Yes, thanks. So as I like to point out, the problem isn't so much information deficit, it's misinformation surplus. It's the forces of delay and denial, as Rosemary points out, trying to rob us of agency because they don't care. They want us not to act, and they don't care if it's because we deny that climate change is real or we deny that we can do anything about it. It leads to that same path of inaction, and that's all they care about. They don't care about the path we take. They just care about the destination.
Thank you. Yes. So moving on to the next question. This actually will stick with you, Mike. This is a question for you from Jennifer. So Jennifer is a climate activist in Canada, although this question could actually easily apply to many other countries. And she asks, my country, Canada, still plans to increase oil production into this decade and beyond, but their communication strategy is about net zero. So she says, they say things like oil won't go away overnight, oil will pay for the transition, we'll have the cleanest, most ethical oil, etc. How do we call out this greenwash when our government is unable to be candid with us or has even been complicit in it? And as she says, this absolutely can apply to very many other countries, as I'm sure a lot of us know. So yes, I'd be very interested to hear your response to this, Mike.
Yeah, it's a great question. How can we call this out? By calling it out, by taking, bad faith politicians and policymakers and institutions to task. And this is a major theme of my book, The New Climate War. It's really, if they can't convince us that climate change isn't real, they're going to try to convince us of anything else that will lead us to disengagement and inaction. And one of those things is that there are other solutions. We don't need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We can engage in geoengineering. We will just shoot particles into the stratosphere to block out the sunlight. What could possibly go wrong? And this is a major thrust, for example, of Bill Gates in his new book. I think it's great that Bill Gates is using his platform to draw awareness to the climate crisis, but I think his prescription is a dangerous one. It understates the degree to which we can solve this problem with existing technologies, existing renewable energy technology, and instead takes us down this dangerous path of other supposed solutions, geoengineering, nuclear energy, which comes with all sorts of risks. And so, yes, we have to look out for those who are promoting false solutions, this narrative that there's some other way to get there other than a very dramatic and immediate transition off of fossil fuels, because that's the only safe way to get to where we need to go.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mike. So we're going to go straight on to another question. So that was pretty comprehensive and very clear. This question is for Stuart, and this is from Lewis in Durham. So Lewis says, reporting of climate change by mainstream media can be very flashy with lots of articles around climate summits, heat waves, or XR protests. But then this engagement dies down once it's over. Yeah, very good point. He says, says, do you think that this is linked to people being apathetic about climate change? And what can we do to make the media have more of a sustained engagement? Yeah, very good questions here. So Stuart, yes, would you like to answer this for us?
Sure, yeah, and I think this touches on a really important point, because media reporting of one way or another is the main way in which most of us get our maybe not scientists working in this field, but get our information about this topic, whether that's sort of traditional media or social media, etc. I do think, I mean, speaking more from a perspective of someone living in the UK, I think the media has got better in its reporting in recent years, some of the media anyway, although it's still a long way off treating the climate crisis as the emergency it is. I think part of the problem has been that the climate crisis and the wider sort of ecological and environmental crisis has tended to be treated as its own sort of self-contained topic. So we've been talking in the past half hour or so about how this is kind of a systemic problem. It's bound up with our use of energy and so on. But the problem is it's so frustratingly often been sort of filed under the environment. And we're seeing fewer polar bears linked to stories about climate change. But that was the kind of caricature. It was always about a polar bear on an iceberg. And that relates a little bit to the the question about how when protests happen, then attention falls away. That protest, especially visible protest in the street, is another sort of way of doing an environmental story. And I think really that what it's about is, I mean, how do we get the media to do this? I'm not quite sure, but it's recognizing that the climate crisis is about so many other things as well. It's embedded in our health and our health system, whether that's climate change directly or kind of related problems like air pollution. It's about our economy, what we invest in or don't invest in. It's about every day. It's about everything. And so I think that recognizing climate change in those sort of all-encompassing terms helps to have a more sort of sustained engagement. On the point of people being apathetic, I don't think people are apathetic. Part of my research over the last 10, 15 years or so has been looking at levels of public awareness and concern. And the last couple of years, we have seen sort of an unprecedented uptick in awareness and concern around the world. There are shades of interest and alarm, and all the way through to people who still are in denial or disinterest. But we have never really been at a point where there is so much attention and concern. We can't take that for granted, because when you look at opinion data over time, levels of concern have fluctuated and not really in any way related to the progression of climate science itself. And that is at least partly tied to media coverage. So as media coverage waxes and wanes, so public attention and concern waxes and wanes. So if there's anyone who is in the media thinking, well, people are apathetic, I won't report on this topic, it's actually the other way round. If you report on the topic, then people are, there is an appetite and there is a genuine concern for hearing about and understanding this topic.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, call out to anyone watching or listening, if you've got any links with the media, get them to report on it more. It's what we need. So yeah, moving on now to a question for Margaret. This is a question from Andre, who's from Exile World in Southern Africa. Brilliant that we've got people tuning in live or sending in questions from all over the world. This is fantastic. So the question is, how can environmental organizations, projects or teams avoid being co-opted by external influences induced by the tension from funding requirements and liabilities involved in facilitating fundraising requirements? Gosh, very important question there, very interesting. Margaret, yes, can you help us with that at all?
Yeah, that it is a great question, and it's one that I'm so intimately familiar with as I started an organization and grew it, and so the fundraising treadmill is so tough, and I'm really excited now to have a chance to be on the funding side to see whether I would really like to be able to move philanthropy in this way, because I agree with Andre, it can be such a blocker. There's this climate emergency movement now, Extinction Rebellion, the school strikers, the climate mobilization, who have a different mentality. They're more realistic mentality, a more effective mentality, but a different mentality than what the movement and climate philanthropy have been doing for a long time. The gradualist, incrementalist, kind of policy-based and Washington insider approach, it just hasn't worked. So that's a much more comfortable area for philanthropy. It's hard to fund movements. All right, so that's a little bit of backstory, but to the question of what do you do? I mean, okay, so what can the movement itself, what can the organizations themselves do? Okay, so one is to try to diversify your fundraising, to raise the more you can get in monthly giving from your membership or from your supporters, so like relatively small dollar monthly giving, that really ideally should be your bread and butter. And then major gifts or grants can fund like a special project or an increase of something, but to have that reliable monthly income from really a base, a membership base, is probably the number one thing I would recommend. I would also say, while it nobody wants to fundraise, right? Like it's really like an area of kind of taboo, because it requires asking people for something uncomfortable, which is money, and it makes us vulnerable and whatever. There's a lot of barriers. And the author Kim Klein, who writes about grassroots fundraising, was very helpful to me in terms of kind of reframing how I was viewing fundraising, in terms of that my mission here, what I'm trying to do, is more important than the fear that I feel. And so to get over, she writes about getting over your fear of asking, that it's part of the work, and it's not easy, and it's not what we would choose, but here we are, and and asking people for money is just part of it. And also, let me just end with a note that also for people listening who have access to resources, personally or institutionally, organizers all over the world, like Andre, are asking the same question. So supporting on the ground organizers and organizations is really a great use of funds.
Thank you. And yeah, I think that's a very important point, is that knowing that it's okay to ask. It's sometimes different cultures, different nations have really different relationship to asking, but it's okay to ask. And actually, some people want to be asked, some people want to be able to help, and they don't know how to offer, they don't know what they can offer. And being asked is sometimes a real gift, a real privilege. So yeah, it's hard for some of us, but yeah, do that and get out there and ask people to help, and you may get a lot more than you expect. Thank you, Margaret. So I'd like to move on to a slightly different theme. So we've got two people, both Rebecca in Carlisle and Pascaline in Frankfurt, who are both asking about communicating with children and teenagers. So I think I'll aim this at Rosemary at Roe. So Rebecca's specific question is, as a primary head teacher, how can I support my pupils in feeling more optimistic whilst at the same time relaying the need to think differently? So yes, important point in terms of communicating with children. So Ro.
Well, I imagine that as a head teacher, your questioner is fully aware of the psychological development of children. And so I think that the first thing you need to take account of is precisely that a 5-year-old's understanding of time and of space is very different from a 12-year-old's or a 15-year-old's. And so everything that you frame in some ways has to be related to the developmental stage of the child. And I think that one of the things which parents have often talked to me about is the fact that they're afraid to raise the topic with their children. And I have a colleague here in Cambridge who, when the schools were open, she runs an absolutely wonderful project which is called Listening Bench. And in the playground, she's a child psychotherapist, and she goes into the school a few times a week, and she sits on her bench, and the children can come and talk to her about anything they like. It's informal. It's not counselling. It's just she's there doing her knitting, sitting on a bench. And if the children want to come and talk, they will come and talk. And the beauty of this is that, of course, because she's open to what they want to talk about, they raise climate, amongst all many other things, such as playground quarrels or falling out with mum or whatever it is they want to talk about. And so she's able to engage the children in that way and to respond to what their needs are. So I think one thing is to think about introducing into your school a project like the Listening Bench, which my colleague Sue runs. Another thing which I think is very helpful to children is to create the situations, particularly primary school children, where you can have conversations about how the world works. And so growing projects, I think, are often very helpful, particularly if you approach them as the place where you have the conversation about where food comes from, why we eat what we do, why we need to change eating what we do. And so I think that you can bring in these daily experiences. And I think that this introduces the element of safety, which is so important when you want to talk about something which is very difficult with children. So I wouldn't frame it as being optimistic or doomy. I would frame it as being able to have the conversation that the children themselves would like to bring up with you. Because regardless of what you think, your children are picking things up all around you, and they have a lot of views and opinions and fears and anxieties. And it's very, very important to create those spaces where that can be heard and responded to carefully, so that children do not become paralyzed and afraid to speak about the things which are troubling them.
Thank you, Ro. Thank you. Really important advice there. And yeah, Mike, you've got something to say on this.
Yeah, I actually do have something to say about this, believe it or not. We've actually, and I really appreciated what Rosemary had to say here. A couple of years ago, I actually co-authored this book, The Tantrum That Saved the World, with children's illustrator and author Meg Herbert. And it's, I won't give the story away, but it's about a girl, Sophia, who throws these tantrums as these animals that have been displaced by climate change are showing up at her door. But ultimately that tantrum grows into a very empowering recognition of the importance of using her voice and demanding change and demanding action of those in a position of authority, those in a position to actually do something about it. Remarkably, it in an odd sense sort of presaged the emergence of the youth climate movement and Greta Thunberg and others. It's actually, it had a limited release, but it's going to be released later this year by a major distributor. And so it will be available. There's a great video on Grist. If you Google The Tantrum That Saved the World, Grist, where a teacher read this book to her class of, it's aimed at 5 to 10-year-olds. I believe it was at the lower end of that range, and just sort of the conversations that it created. And it was so wonderful to watch that, because that's really what it does. It creates an opportunity for conversation. And there are many other efforts out there as well, but I just thought I would mention this one. Look out for it later this year. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And yeah, just leading on from that, actually, if you've not come across it, there's still a lot of resources online from the Youth Climate Summit, which myself and Andy Wynne, who's the educational director of a group called Healthy Mind UK, who run a great project for schools called EcoHeads, dealing with climate anxiety. He's an educational psychologist, and we work together doing a series of videos and educational resources for schools as part of the Youth Climate Summit. So I believe a lot of that is still also online. And also, just to mention, Andy was also collaborated with me on a book that I've spent the last year and a half writing, which was translating kind of what's going on in the climate and ecological crisis for young people aged 8 to 13, but in a way that also offers a lot of truth, because as Mike and Ro have just both said, you know, kids do know what's going on. They want to know the truth. They don't want it sort of glossed over, because it's very confusing. They're hearing some reports from families, some teachers, from some they watch the news, and they want to know actually what's going on, but also in a way that can bring hope and give real life examples of things that are already going on that are positive on the planet, and what individuals and children even can do to help. So I've collated a lot of that in the book. It's just sort of follow up to this book, which some of you might have seen, which was my book from last year, which was Brain Fizzing Facts, and the follow up to that, which is coming out in June, which is mostly around climate and ecological stuff. Lots of fun wee and poo jokes in there as well, just thrown in for good measure, but it's called World Whizzing Facts, Awesome Earth Questions Answered. So that's got a lot of stories in it, like I say, of hopeful actions that children can take, and hopeful stories that are going on from around the world to show that it isn't all doom and gloom, but there is a lot of truth in that as well. So yes, thank you, Mike, for that book recommendation as well. So yes, Margaret, thank you. You've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the element of talking with children, which is the betrayal that they feel by the adults in their life for allowing this to unfold and not protecting them. And that I think this is a critical emotional dimension to be aware of. And the thing that you want to be able to say to your child and is, I am doing everything that I can to make a better world for you, and to involve them in whatever kind of age appropriate ways, such as the youth climate strikes being the best example, but there's others as well. But that the need for children to believe that their parents and the other adults in their lives are acting rationally and morally and you know, in a way that's taking them into account is a really, really core need for children. They need that more than they need, oh, it's going to be fine, or, you know, we can have a bright future. That so showing that solidarity with children, I just want to emphasize.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really important, showing that we get it and that we're on it, or at least on it as much as we can, but there is obviously only as on it as we can be right now. Let's stick with you, Margaret. Actually, we've got a question for you from Sarah from Morpeth. She says, I agree with Margaret that we shouldn't distort the truth in our messaging, but the way we frame our message is incredibly important, absolutely, particularly when speaking to people that we don't necessarily agree with. What advice do you and the other panelists have on speaking to those with differing views and values to our own? Yeah, really important question there, thank you. Otherwise we're just stuck in an echo chamber, aren't we? Yes, Margaret.
So my big piece of advice is to be personal and emotional, that to talk with others. I mean, this isn't necessarily the right approach for every single setting, but generally speaking, when you're talking with your friends and family and neighbors and coworkers and whatnot, addressing, like, trying to reckon with together, and starting with yourself, how it feels to be facing this reality, how it makes you think about the future differently, and kind of how it's impacting your plans and your, career, your thoughts about your career or having children, or where you want to move, and asking your friend, family, colleague, whatever, and how do you feel? I just think that is, it's like kind of taking whatever, the side door or something, you by making it personal rather than, I'm here with an agenda. It's just totally different. It's just a totally different way of connecting and approaching the issue. And I think you'll find that people who might be totally closed off to, did you know that there's 420 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, and that hasn't been the case for this many years, right? For people who just be totally closed off to that, like whatever, your Republican uncle or whatever might have a very different reaction to, I've been really depressed recently. And a lot of it has to do with what I'm hearing about the climate, and, I'm really struggling.
Thank you. Thank you. So question, actually, we'll go to Mike again on this one. So there's lots of questions that have been coming in about feedbacks and tipping points, unsurprisingly. So this question specifically is from David from the University of Toronto. And David says, there are voices who lead me to think that we are all but guaranteed unstoppable and apocalyptic heating. But the attitude that our problem is solvable and not just theoretically so inspires me to keep going. Yeah, I know the feeling, thank you. So his question is, how can we reconcile these positions? And is there evidence that it is still solvable? So yeah, Mike, can you start us off on this one?
Yeah, and it comes down to this issue of urgency and agency. Urgency, we're already seeing dangerous climate change impacts. We have to act now. Agency, we can still act. And here, the science actually is on our side. And that's why I'm often troubled by some of these doomist narratives that are premised on distortions of the science, this idea that we're now already committed to runaway warming. The reality is that over the last decade or so, as climate modeling experiments have become more realistic, in the old days, we would treat carbon dioxide as a control knob. And this idea is you just turn it up and the climate warms up in response to that. And when you model the human impact on climate that way, you observe what's known as committed warming, which is to say that the planet continues to warm for decades, even after we stop burning carbon. And that's because of the thermal inertia of the oceans. And so we used to say that even if we stop burning carbon now, the planet will warm up for decades. And so there isn't an immediate impact on our efforts to decarbonize our civilization. The reality is, as we do more realistic experiments where CO2 isn't treated as a control knob, we treat it the way it actually worked. We put carbon into the atmosphere, and the climate system determines what happens to that carbon. In the terrestrial biosphere, plants take up some of that carbon. The oceans take up some of that carbon. In fact, collectively, they've taken up about half the carbon we put into the atmosphere. So in those more realistic experiments, what we find is that when we stop burning carbon, surface temperatures plateau pretty quickly. They stabilize within a few years. And that's because while you do have that committed warming effect, the oceans in particular are drawing down CO2 out of the atmosphere. So CO2 is actually coming down. And the net effect is that temperatures sort of stabilize at the level that they're at when you stop burning carbon. That's why we can actually define what's known as a carbon budget. The reason we can say there's this much carbon left that we can burn and keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius is because of that understanding of how it works. And so if you understand if you look at our best scientific understanding of that problem, now what it tells us is that there is an immediate and direct impact of our efforts to bring carbon emissions down. Now, there are some components of the system that will continue to respond for decades down the road. And we worry about, for example, the collapse of ice sheets and the sea level rise that entails. We may be committed now to substantial loss of ice from the ice sheets and sea level rise, and ocean acidification will continue on as well. So I don't want to be Panglossian here. There are some damaging long-term impacts, but the warming of the surface of the planet and all of the impacts connected to that really do stabilize fairly quickly if we stop burning carbon. That's why we have to stop burning carbon.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, absolutely important there as well. I just while I thought of it, I just wanted to just very briefly circle back to the question where we were talking about communicating to kids in a way that gives them optimism. Because as we were talking, I was just thinking in terms of examples, there's some really wonderful examples of rewilding projects going on here in the UK, which is where I am, but also there's a wonderful one in the Netherlands, where we are seeing wildlife coming back. It's very small scale and it needs to be done a lot more. But I've found in my work with young people that it's lovely to give examples of where human action can actually help the wildlife to come back, or even the opposite, where human actually taking a step back and actually doing nothing at all and leaving land can sometimes recultivate. And I think kids can get on board with animals coming back. There's also a lovely study that shows that a lot of freshwater insects, some freshwater insects are actually on the increase finally again, potentially due to some cleaning out of waterways in this country, at least in the UK. So there are stories, and there's also wonderful projects being undertaken at the moment in terms of rewilding the oceans, projects to help seaweed and to help fish to come back in and churning up the oceans. So there's some lovely really visual stories, and you can also talk about clean energy and how that's growing, and wind farms and solar energy and hydroelectric farms, and so actually painting the picture of the positive things that are going on the planet, so that kids actually can feel that they can do something and that there is still hope, even though we of course also need to really speak in alignment with the severity and the seriousness of what's going on, and showing them that we are in ourselves as teachers and educators and parents acting in alignment with that truth as well. So we now have a question. This question is for Stuart, and this is from George at the University of York. How can the scientific community make their findings more accessible and understandable to the general public? Yeah, great question here. So yes, Stuart, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a very good question, and kind of a tricky one as well. I mean, anyone who works in research knows that there's a constant sort of deluge of papers. You cannot keep up with the thousands and thousands of papers that are published all the time. And I think even if you do scientific research as part of your day job, it's very hard to keep up with that. I mean, in terms of the scientific community making their findings more accessible, I think maybe there's sort of two basic questions here. Why should I care what your research says, and what do you actually want me to do? And that may not actually be in a particular study itself. You know, individual scientific papers can be often quite technical or obscure, or they may not warrant kind of a news story or kind of broadcasting in and of themselves. But I think what we should maybe get good at doing is sort of communicating around more general themes, bringing in sort of wider research topics. So we've talked, for example, a lot today about sort of emotional responses to climate change, how we deal with the sort of feelings that come with confronting the crisis. And you know, if you're, for example, a researcher working on the psychology of climate change, then you can write a blog or a news piece or another article in those senses around that sort of thematic topic, bringing in your own research and other people's research. So I think we perhaps have to think in terms of what is of interest and of relevance to people, and how does our research speak to that. I mean, another thing I think is that when scientists set out to communicate their research, that there can often be a bit of a sort of awkwardness between the kind of the scientific way of communicating research, as you might do at a conference, which is full of sort of technicalities and the methodological questions and the caveats and the limitations and the, you know, your recent study is always going to be sort of provisional, versus what you might want to do with a more public audience, which is to get across the main gist. And I think we perhaps need to be a bit more comfortable about, you know, just being clear about getting across the gist. This isn't, you're not at a scientific conference. You want to get across what matters, for example, the urgency of climate change, and that we can do something about it. Just to mention, actually, we did, myself and various other people did do a research project a couple of years ago called the Climate Communication Project, where we did try and set out to look at the various ways that scientists and others, journalists, practitioners, were trying to communicate climate change. And you know, we came up with there was quite a diversity of ways in which people were trying to do this. Some people were setting out to engage with people and communicate in ways that got people fired up, involved in politics, or change their behaviors. Other people were more concerned to sort of get across the scientific facts and so on. So I think that there is a diversity of range, but the key thing is to get out there, be out of your comfort zone. Don't worry if you feel awkward and uncomfortable, and just try and have a dialogue with people, which is the other thing, you know. Listen to what people are saying, have a dialogue as well.
Thank you, Stuart. I think, you know, just continuing on that theme, I think it's also really important that we bring our own feelings and emotions to the table, like as Margaret and Ro have also both talked about, that, you know, talk as scientists, even though we're communicating scientific information, you know, how does it make us feel? How do we feel about what we're communicating about? And almost signposting in a way to how should the person reading or hearing this information, how should they feel? And of course, we can't tell people how to feel, but historically, scientists have very much our sort of unwritten contract, if you like, has been to be totally unemotive and to just simply communicate facts, on the understanding that those facts will be relayed to the public by the government, by the media, in a way that helps the public to understand how to feel about those facts. And that has just not happened. So in a sense, as scientists now, and that's why the group of us who formed this community, Extinction Rebellion Scientists, it's really important to actually let scientists know that it's okay now for us to go out there and actually speak from the heart, and actually speak about our feelings, about the information we're sharing, and when we feel that we can, to actually take action as well, through whatever means are available to us. So yeah, Margaret, I see your hand, and then we'll move on just to the final question of this evening.
I just wanted to emphasize what you're saying, Emily, because I think it's so important that when scientists communicate about the climate without sharing their own feelings, they are modeling an approach that the public thinks, okay, well, there's this thing going on, but like, you know, keep a really even keel, stay calm, don't like get too distressed. And it's a like a miscommunication, because it's like, as Stuart was saying, it's not a scientific meeting or, you know, conference. So yeah, keeping that, I just totally agree.
Thank you. And Mike? Oh, Mike, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And, you know, I think when you're engaged in science communication, and you stick just to the science and not its implications, and not to the policy dimensions or the ethical dimensions, I think you come across as not a very convincing messenger. Ultimately, you're a person, and you want your audience to connect with you as a person. I'm a father. I have a daughter who's 15 years old. I care about the future of the planet that she and her you know, friends and generation will encounter, and it's okay to express that. You know, we don't leave our citizenship at the laboratory door. Yes, we're scientists, but we're also citizens who care about this planet, and it's appropriate for us to comment, you know, from that perspective, and to make clear that that perspective is actually informed by an assessment of the science. We understand the message of the science, the implications of the science, and we need to share that understanding with the public, with our audiences.
Brilliant, thank you, great roundup there. So I'll move on now to our last question of the evening, or the afternoon, depending where you're tuning in from, or even the morning. So this is to the whole panel, and it's a question from Lewis in XR Birmingham. Question is an interesting one here. What would you consider the biggest strengths and biggest weaknesses of Extinction Rebellion's public messaging? In other words, key messages, slogans, website, banners, posters, designs, etc. So we'll need to keep this short because we're coming towards the end, but yeah, it would be lovely to have all of your responses, you know, be honest. What do you think of Extinction Rebellion's messaging around the crisis? So shall we start with Ro, or put your hands up, or when you're ready to speak on this one?
I'd say the strongest thing is the visual impact of some of the actions, and I would say the weakest thing is the capacity of some XR members to talk to the public when you're actually on those protests.
Thank you, Ro. Yeah, great feedback. When you say capacity, can you just clarify what you mean by that, just for anyone?
I mean that so many people are often still so distressed themselves about climate that they haven't arrived at a calm place from which they can listen with curiosity and gauge the reactions of those they're speaking to. And so I think there's a process which people need to go through in order to be good communicators in these often very tiny interactions which you have with members of the public. And that's something which I've been trying to pay a lot of attention to recently.
Yeah, I think that's a super clear point, because actually what we've got to get is that sweet spot. We've got to get that sweet spot where we're being emotive enough and emotional enough to show that actually what we're relaying is important, you know, because the scientists who are just saying facts, that's not going to cut it either. But if we ourselves, and I've been guilty of this myself, are so upset or frustrated or angry that actually we're coming across as too adversarial, too aggressive almost sometimes, or too upset, that actually doesn't get the message across either. So as Margaret said earlier, it's about listening as well, finding out where the other person is at and being able to really hear them, as you've beautifully put there, Rose. Thank you very much. Mike.
Yeah, so you know, I think it's great, the public awareness that Extinction Rebellion has brought to this issue, and I applaud them for doing that. I think it's an essential movement, and it's contributed to the progress that we're actually making. I've already sort of conveyed where I sometimes become concerned when the messaging crosses over from concern and urgency into doomism, and we have to make sure that we avoid that we're faithful to the science, because the scientific facts alone are a compelling reason to act, and to act with urgency now. And we don't have to distort the facts. We don't have to overstate the threat, because the threat is very real. And any efforts on our part through movements like Extinction Rebellion, the youth climate movement, to convey both the urgency and the agency, that's part of why we're at this moment where there really is an opportunity for meaningful action, because of that level of public organization, of civic organization that we're now seeing.
Thank you, Mike. Stuart.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved on and off with Extinction Rebellion myself, including various actions and so on. And so I agree with Mike. I think Extinction Rebellion has been absolutely instrumental in raising the alarm and raising public concern and awareness. Actually, one of the, just as an aside, when not the April extinction blockade, but the one, oh gosh, I can't remember what month of the year it was, but one of the Extinction Rebellion blockades, I was at the Scientists for XR tent for a while, and I wasn't there when he came along, but Miles Allen, who is one of the kind of most senior climate scientists in the world behind the IPCC's 1.5 report, came along and said, thank you, you have meant that our science is being heard. He commented on how he'd just been to one of the government departments talking about how they could tackle emissions, and he said his words were that he didn't think he would have been able to do that without Extinction Rebellion and the Fridays for Future movement pushing that. So it's undoubtedly true that Extinction Rebellion has had a big impact. For me, one of the strengths, one of the reasons I got involved, and one of the most powerful parts of XR has been its willingness to tell the truth in a brutally honest and visceral way. And we can certainly quibble and debate about where truth becomes doom and so on, and that's really important. But it's amazing that ever needed saying, that so many communicators have been vacillating and tiptoeing around this issue, and then XR kind of smashed into the scene and really just said, no, we're going to try and tell the truth. So that was very important. A concern I've had throughout, and I understand why it's been a tactic, but is in cases where it feels like the public is being targeted. And I've sat in roads myself, blocking traffic and so on, and I'm just not convinced that's sustainable in the long term. I mean, I think some of the actions which blocked kind of main parts of London with the pink boat and so on were very visual and very important. But I think going forward, XR needs to sort of think about actions which target the public and be very careful about those. And for that reason, I think that more recent actions targeting the media and as currently targeting the financial system and the banks are a good direction to be going in. And that's the sort of that's a good direction, I think.
Thank you. Yes, and I think it was October 2019, I think it was, when the XR scientist tent and you were on the streets and Miles Allen came along, and yeah, it was a really powerful time, I think, for all of us who were out there. And yeah, last but not least, so Margaret, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I agree with what people have said. I love Extinction Rebellion. The Tell the Truth little flag is on my board there from when I went to Rebellion Day 1 in London and helped whatever with that initial effort. It was one of the most thrilling times of my life. I love the urgency, which comes across in, I would say, just about all Extinction Rebellion communications is pretty baked into the name. And the emphasis on telling the truth and rapid decarbonization. The Citizens Assembly thing is really fascinating to me. This was really my first exposure to the concept. It's not very well known in the United States. I think it's, I'm fine with it. I guess you would say I'm very interested. And then as Mike was saying, the idea of urgency and agency, I think XR does this really, really well, because they say the situation is so bad, but you are invited to, be on the front lines of a revolution, right? But through its self-organizing systems and its decentralized structure and its attitude towards growth and welcome and inclusiveness and just growing with more and more people. I think it really did a great job and is doing so in terms of not just exposing people to the urgency, but then also leading them into an engaged response.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. So actually, unfortunately, we are coming near to the end now. I'm really sorry if we haven't had time to answer your questions. There's been so many amazing questions coming in, and I'm sure you'll all agree that this has been a really fascinating and important discussion. And what seems clear to me, at least from all of the panelists, is that if we want people to get on board with the urgent need for action, we need to communicate the facts. We need to communicate them clearly, but we also need to emphasize just how bad it really is and how much worse it's likely to get, and that it's okay to instill fear, because it is scary. And the fear is okay as long as we let that fear move through, and as long as we meet people where we're at, we notice how they are, and we invite them to also bring themselves, and we're also bringing ourselves to that as we communicate. But as long as we stick to the facts, that's okay. But it's also important that we do remind people of their agency, that they still have, that we all still have as a world population, as a planet, that we do still have agency to prevent the absolute worst, even if there are some things that are already pretty bad and already are coming up that are going to be pretty bad. So to round things up, I'd like to now give each of our panelists just 1 minute to give your final thoughts on tonight's discussion and to leave us with any take-home messages that you would like to leave us and our audience with as we go on our way for the rest of the day. So if I start with you, Margaret, actually, you've just been speaking. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for hosting this panel and for joining. I'd like to end by inviting viewers to come to a conversation about climate feelings that I've been hosting. It's through a unique software platform. So you'll call in and be on like a Zoom-like setting, and then with like 3 or 4 people from all over the world, and you'll go through prompt questions like, how do you feel about the climate emergency? In a sequence, and also watch short videos of me explaining emotional concepts. So it's you can view that sign up for that at climateawakening.org. It's free. It's I made it with a small team because of this issue, right? Because of how important it is to discuss the intense feelings that come up around the climate emergency and how little opportunity there is for doing that. So yeah, climateawakening.org. It would be great to have you there and, process some of these emotions together.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. Stuart, would you like to sum up for us?
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, I think that it's really good that the question of agency has come up throughout this discussion, that however bad things seem, we do have agency. We can do something about this. And I would say that, as coming back to this question of individual action, as an individual, you have agency as part of changing the system and the structures which are, continue this continue our high carbon society. We have to view ourselves as being part of changing that system through our individual agency. I think it's been really good that we've talked about the sense that how you feel about the climate crisis matters. It is upsetting, it is fearful. There are lots of other emotions we experience as well. Anger, hope, all of those things are valid and are important to address and talk about. And kind of coming back to Mike's point about doom, do not succumb to doom. There are a lot of dodgy things said which can fit into a doomist narrative, and don't be tempted. It's never too late to deal with this problem, but we do need to move as fast as possible.
Thank you, Stuart. Mike?
Sure. I don't have much to add. Those comments really summarize my own position here. This has been a wonderful conversation, a very invigorating conversation. I hope it's the first of many more of this sort. And I guess the point that I would leave you with is the point, that I try to make in the new climate war, in my new book, which is that, we are so close now to finally seeing the action that so many have worked towards for decades, in substantial part because of the organizing, because of the mobilization by groups like Extinction Rebellion, the youth climate movement. But there are still obstacles that are being thrown in our path by the forces of inaction, what I call the inactivists in the book. And it's no longer denial of the evidence because people can see the evidence now. That doesn't cut it. So instead, the inactivists are promoting these other tactics that are aimed at, for example, robbing us of agency, convincing us it's too late to do anything about the problem, proposing false solutions, generating conflict, dividing us so that we fight with each other and don't present a united voice demanding change. So look out for those tactics, recognize them, and learn how to push back at them. And that's really what my book is about, because we really are close now. We can taste it, we can smell it, we can feel it. This is our moment. Let's not, let's not fail to take advantage of it.
Thank you, Mike. And finally, Ro.
Right, I'd just like to point you at some resources. So if you want to know more about the way I was talking about the different kinds of process and content in a conversation, if you go to the Carbon Conversations website and look for my book In Time for Tomorrow, which you can download, that's all in chapter 6. I'd like to remind people also of the work of Marshall Gantz, which I use an awful lot in my workshops where I'm facilitating workshops on climate communication, and his work on the story of self, story of us, and story of now. And that is one of the most powerful methods I have found of helping activists to communicate an awful lot better about climate change. Also, just point people to my YouTube channel where you'll find me talking about a lot of these issues, to my blog where I do talk about how to speak publicly in public situations with this kind of emotional intelligence. And finally, to the work of Climate Outreach in the UK, have had an awful lot of very helpful advice on their site about good ways of communicating about climate issues to a lot of different audiences. So just like to leave you with those ideas of where to look to know more.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry to say that really is all we've got time for today. So I'd like to thank all of our amazing panelists for sharing their knowledge and their understanding. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's amazing to have had you all here. And thank you to everyone watching for your brilliant questions. Everything has been recorded and it will be available on the Scientists for Extinction Rebellion YouTube channel and also on our Facebook page. So please do share it with your friends and family because we really do need to get the word out. If you want to learn more about the climate and ecological crisis and why it is that we do need to act now, please do have a look at our free, easy to read online guide to the crisis, which is called Emergency on Planet Earth, written by myself with the support of the XR scientist community and reviewed by a team of world-class scientists. It's available on the Extinction Rebellion UK website if you look under Tell the Truth. And there's also a summary of that document in a lot of talks that I've given that you can find, Emergency on Planet Earth talks and a version for kids, which is actually called Brain Fizzing Facts, which is on my YouTube channel I've got a Climate Talks playlist. As I said earlier, if you've got kids, you want to help them understand what's going on, the Youth Climate Summit is a place to look. That was on last year. Also Healthy Mind UK, as I mentioned earlier, and my new book, World Whizzing Facts, Awesome Earth Questions Answered. You can pre-order that now online from any good bookstores. And remember, it's only through spreading the truth about climate and ecological emergency that we've got any hope really of seeing any real action to save us from catastrophe. So how you can help is by spreading the word. So that's all we've got time for today. Thank you again to our panelists, to you. We'll be back on the 4th of May at 7 p.m, that's UK time, British summer time, for an important discussion on the benefits of rewilding with another amazing group of expert panelists. In the meantime, if you want to get involved with XR Scientists, you can find us through our website, scientistsforxr.earth. Please follow us on Facebook if you want to be kept up to date with what we're up to. Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, we've got a page there. And we've also got Twitter at ScientistsX, at ScientistsX. So thank you for watching, and wherever you are, please stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.